chain reaction. So it can't get out of control the way we've seen in fission. This is not a criticism of fission. It's just the facts of difference. And it's why fusion has the capacity to be built, sited, placed safely anywhere. It uses the main fuel it uses across the board is derived from seawater. Just tiny drops of heavy hydrogen in seawater. So is there anybody still confused? And please show of hands if you are, because I'm happy to go into greater detail. I often find myself talking about fusion and I realize halfway through the conversation, nobody knew what I was talking about. Yeah. You're confused. Okay. Well, fission is about, the breaking of a very heavy mineral, very heavy uranium, right? And it starts a chain reaction. Whereas fusion is the fusing of very, very light atomic structures, right? So very light atoms of hydrogen. And it produces more energy than actually even fission. It produces energy in the form of heat, right? So it happens in a very highly heated chamber. Now, I'm not going to describe it any further than that because in the United States, there are 25 different companies working on different ways to either confine magnetically or use a targeted laser approach. Some of them might call them guns. I would caution them quickly not to do that because it is not a weaponizable, it's not a weapons program. And many of them are hybrid approaches, but all of them are different. And that's one of the beauties of fusion. Right now, we've got 25 in the US, and there are at least 47 that we've calculated globally. So it is happening. It's happening quickly in the last 3 years. I spoke at the COP26 in Glasgow, which was the first COP that recognized fusion. And it was the last day in a small panel. It was remarkable for fusion. It wasn't remarkable for COP. Well, 3 years later, it is being spoken about here. We're running another panel in the blue zone, and we'll leave here and run to the green zone for an announcement by our special envoy, Senator Kerry, on further US commitment to the whole world. So why is an NGO working for humanity working on fusion? Well, because it's one of the only things that could actually provide equitable power globally. It can be put anywhere. So whether it is in the developed United States or undeveloped parts of Africa, it is capable of placing energy in the background and letting the use of energy be part of everybody's lives. So think about all the technologies that are starting to move, right? But today we're focusing on the legal structure. How do we, because all of you are, I assume, somewhere in the legal field, and this is something to watch. Mary Claire is a great colleague of ours, and I know that she is looking at all of the different ways that can incent and move fusion forward within the COP structure and other structures. What we have today is a team of folks who represent both the companies who are, well, they're not here yet. Hopefully Jim is coming. Jim McNiel. Okay. Some of the companies that are emerging in fusion, and we have one of the architects of the codes and standards for the actual pieces of fusion, so that, the pressure vessel and the other components that we'll need. And all of these voices, as well as the voice of some of our earliest hands raised, we want it, we need it, from Tanzania, Humphrey, Mrema, are here to talk about what the regulatory path is today and where it could go as we move fusion forward. But that fusion forward, that regulatory path moving forward, in part will be up to all of you, because you're going to be involved in setting not just the health and safety standards, which are typically governed by regulatory bodies in the US. We call it the NRC, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. In the UK, fusion sits under the Natural Resources Agency. but they establish what the risk factor is to humans. And in the US, they've determined that that risk factor is akin to medical isotopes from a medical waste from a medical hospital or an accelerator. In other words, it's just a waste product and a minimal amount of a waste product. Now, as fusion moves forward, we're going to learn more about it. But the one thing we know we're not going to see a lot of is there won't be any high-level waste, and there will be probably, I would guess, a sliding scale away from any waste. In fact, waiting for Jim McNiel from TAE, because TAE is one of the oldest fusion companies, and they're approaching fusion without using any radioactive materials. So when I say fusion is the future, fusion will provide the steady state renewable power that will allow wind and solar and all of the renewables that we know of today to expand greatly without having to build an infrastructure for a fossil fuel. And as I know everybody in this room knows, that's the goal. We need to keep fossil fuel in the ground. We need to transition quickly. The word transition can sometimes mean a bridge to nowhere, or it can mean something we commit to do because we know we have the technologies either in hand or coming that will allow us to do it. And fusion is exactly that kind of disruptive technology. So with that, I will say quickly that there are three categories. I've told you about the magnetic confinement, laser-based inertial confinement, and hybrid approaches. And these are, look, some of this is boring language, but it just says that there are different types of ways to force those atoms to fuse, which they reject each other. So you have to create a very high heated space and move in magnetic confinement where where there's fast movement and then there's a bounce, right? Then they create, and with that bounce that you create fusion, the enormous amount of heat is released, and how that heat, or in the case of one of our companies, Andrew, Proffitt is here from Helion, they're delivering, instead of heat to an industrial customer or the heat that is typically produced by a fossil fuel, like a boiler, right? The way we produce most fossil fuel energy that's on the grid is through a boiler that produces heat, that heats up water, creates steam, runs turbines, and produces electricity. In some respects, what we're talking about is replacing that boiler, right? In other respects, with Helion's delivering electricity directly. And because we have such diversity of technology, we also have technologies in fusion that are very small, that are approaching it from the standpoint of providing mobile technologies. And we have some that are looking at fuel production in hydrogen because it's a very efficient way to produce hydrogen. And some are looking at producing direct heat for electricity. And because each type has a different market niche, I celebrate that we have this kind of diversity. Just like I celebrate the fact that the world is very diverse, and the more people we hear from, the better chance we have to get the future, I won't say it right, but we'll make a better job of it. And that's why Energy for the Common Good commits to speaking to communities all over the world about fusion, because we don't think there's one place for fusion. And we want to make sure that early fusion has many markets, not just the UK, the US, and Europe, which is where it's been developed historically. So with that, I would like to really move us over to why we're here today and start to talk about our panel, because we want the UNFCCC to support rapid and equitable development, and we want to diversify and include all knowledge and access, yours, and then we want you to be interested enough that you're going to talk to others about it. And with that, I'm going to turn our panel over to Humphrey Mrema. He is traveled here from Tanzania, and he represents the Youth Survival Network, which is and I'm trying to get, he sent me very nicely some points and I want to make them correctly. He's going to present a short background of energy development in Africa and Tanzania, so you understand why the need is there and the level of untapped renewable potential, which you all know. I mean, Africa has a huge solar potential and a lot of wind. We want to talk about why Tanzania needs fusion today. What are the industrials that it'll bring in? And then we're going to talk about a roadmap which would involve all youth voices. That's one of the things Energy for the Common Good does to start with. We work in communities where there is an energy need, and we often start with youth because they're the ones that are going to work on this technology, and they're the ones that are inheriting the problem that many of us older people have created, or at least watched. So that will be Humphrey's component, and then we're supposed to have 3 companies on the screen. Right now, I think we have 2. Hopefully we'll be joined by a 3rd. And so right now, Andrew Proffitt at Helion is representing you've got a lot on his shoulders. So for the purpose of today, we want to talk about the regulatory burden that happens when you launch a new technology. All of you probably looked into this or seen it in case law. And then we want to talk about the tools that we can develop together to incentivize that market to open. I worked in renewables before fusion, and I worked on the renewable portfolio standards and the tax credits and all of the many carrots that brought renewable energy somewhat forward in the United States. And that's what we want your help in bringing forward on a world stage. And then we want to share the approaches which will benefit diversity of fusion. In other words, let's not just say it's going to be a replacement for coal boilers. Let's find 1,000 ways to put fusion to work. And because like renewables, we have that diversity in fusion. So having introduced Andrew Proffitt, Andrew is a secret agent here because he came straight from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission and policy to work for Helion. So he has some really good insights. And then we have Thomas over here, and Thomas is working on the codes and standards, as I said. And then we have Humphrey, who is the future. He's all the customers and all the interests. So with that, I'd like to ask a couple questions of my panel. Humphrey, why should we listen to the Youth and Survival Network now? What should Fusion think about when you approach this issue, and why should they make Tanzania or any one of the many nations in Africa one of their first places to develop?
Okay, thank you so much. It's such a privilege to be in this panel. I'm coming from Africa, particularly Tanzania. Statistics shows by 2022, more than 43% of the population in Africa lacks reliable energy and electricity. And when you narrow down it to Tanzania, a country with a population of 60 million people, we are a climate sensitive country, of which we highly depend on fossil fuel for electricity as well as hydro. 68% of our electricity comes from natural gas, and the remaining 30% comes from hydro. However, despite having abundant sources in natural gas, Tanzania still faces a lot of repercussions because of energy insecurity. And this has made our country to come up with a national climate change response strategy of 5 years from 2021 to 2026, which has allowed the economy to diversify its energy sources. Tanzania has a lot of untapped potentials in different renewable energy, including fusion, because we know fusion fuel is seawater. And we are just surrounded by, we have Indian Ocean on our east side, and we do also have a lot of fresh water and other water sources. However, we do face a lot of challenges, and I can say, for example, now Tanzania, we are having a very huge project of standard gauge railway with more than 1,400 kilometers stretching from the northern part of Tanzania to the eastern one. And we envision this train to use electricity. However, we are not so sure about its sustainability because of the energy crisis that our country we currently face. This is why we are looking onto fusion energy. Because when we are speaking about fusion energy, the first thing that our politicians and leaders will say, it is hard to start and it's challenging to maintain, but everything is possible. It is possible because what we need is investment in technology. And investment in technology can come in Tanzania, not directly through government investment. We can provide room for PPP, public-private partnership, through which it can be a line and one of the ways to focus on how this thing can be possible. I was going through the national energy policy in Tanzania, and I was even sharing with my colleague here. There is no any place that has mentioned fusion. We are more into hydro, we are more into solar, we are more into wind, which have not tapped yet. Currently, our energy demand in Tanzania, it's 1,800 megawatt, and we are producing only 1,400, of which still it's not enough. Then when we are speaking about fusion, we are speaking about cleaner energy. We are speaking about energy which is abundant, and we are speaking about energy which is safe. And in the course of developing this, there will be a lot of employment opportunities that will be created. So now what we are doing together with our colleagues from Energy for Common Good, we are on the verge of having a Youth for Energy Fusion Network that will be a global initiative. First is to do awareness raising, capacity development, as well as advocacy. Because we can speak about fusion while a lot of people don't know about it. When you come to Africa, when you come to Tanzania, we only know wind, we only know solar, which up to now, unfortunately, solar has provided only 89 megawatts in the country. When we are speaking about natural gas, it's not sustainable because it's a fossil fuel, even if we say it's a cleaner fossil fuel. So what is the vision? Our vision is to have strategic campaigns. First is to raise awareness, because we need more energy professionals. Not only in Tanzania, the case is similar to most of the global South countries. We need more awareness to increase our capacity in the matter, in the subject matter. After then, it will be easier for us to influence policies. Something good about the country like Tanzania and other countries, it's that we are open to more energy sources as far as they are cleaner, they are safe, and they are sustainable.
Thank you. And so now, I mean, what better, I hope you were listening, Andrew, because I would love to see Helion have a power device plan for Tanzania before it blankets the rest of the US. But with that, I'd like to pull Andrew into the conversation. Sorry, I'm looking at your name instead of your face.
Can you hear me, Jane?
Ah, perfect. And I'd love to have you give a little bit of the background on what Helion's doing, some of the excitement that Helion has brought to the energy and the fusion energy conversation recently, and why this room should think about engaging on the regulatory side of fusion on the and work with us to build its incentives now versus sit back and wait.
Yeah, absolutely. Can you guys see the screen that I'm sharing here?
There we go. Now you get to see.
Great, perfect. I apologize, my video's not working. I think there was a VPN requirement, so apologize for that. I didn't realize ahead of time. But good morning, all. Andrew Proffitt, I'm a regulatory specialist here at Helion Energy. We're one of the many companies Jane mentioned that are pursuing fusion energy in the U.S. and we're moving quite rapidly. But just a little bit about me. Jane mentioned I was recently transitioned from the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission to Helion. I really kind of lucked into fusion. I was in between positions and moving around, and there was an opportunity to work on a strategy for how the NRC would regulate fusion, which came out of a congressional direction in the 2019 timeframe for NRC to start preparing for fusion, and it kind of been something that had been passed around like a bit of a hot potato. Several staff had been moving around the agency or leaving the agency that had been leading the project, and it kind of fell in my lap toward the very end, and I was lucky enough to jump on and engage with the fusion community and really learn about the excitement here after coming from a background in fission. But it's extremely exciting time, extremely exciting technology, and as viewing it from the NRC and getting to see a little bit of the insides of Helion made it very attractive when I saw a position open there to be able to move over. So we were founded in 2013, so I've been around actually 10 years now, and we're in the Seattle, Washington area, just a little bit north of Seattle in Everett, Washington. Over 200 folks now, and it's actually quite impressive, even coming from sort of the advanced fission area where some of the companies are actually quite smaller and not necessarily building machines like we are and constructing. So what you see there is our 6th generation prototype in the background of this picture. And that's the machine. We actually reached 100 million degrees Celsius in that machine, and that's a very important temperature from a fusion perspective, as that's where you can start to reach fusion conditions that can be commercially viable. So that was a very important milestone for that machine. We've now retired that one. That one's now taken apart, and we're working on building our 7th machine. We think we got most of what we could out of that one, and we're rapidly moving forward, which is actually one of the most exciting things coming from the government bureaucracy in the U.S. and moving to a private fusion company. Things move very quickly at Helion. Another key is we're actually funded through commercialization, so we're completely funded to produce our next 7th generation device, which we're building in Everett, Washington, and funded to our Microsoft power purchase agreement, where we have an agreement in 2028 to begin producing electricity for them. And following on that, we actually had another recent announcement with Nucor Steel to provide them up to 500 megawatts of electricity at one of their sites in the U.S.
And Andrew, if I could just interrupt you
Yep.
there, I really want to highlight this, because I came from the renewable industry, and power purchase agreements are no laughing matter. That's a contract. You all know about contracts. So that means that Microsoft has looked at Helion deeply, and they've made a commitment with Helion that they will buy the power that Helion will deliver, and they've put a date on that. Now that now tells you that there will be fusion electricity being produced at a price point that's been agreed on in 5 years. Think about that. Everybody said it was 30 years away forever. Well, it's 5 years away. Ask Microsoft. And then the Nucor Steel deal is also one of my favorites, and we're going to talk about a little bit of the background on the importance of materials with our friend Thomas here. But Nucor Steel is betting its green supply on partnering with Helion. Is that fair to say, Andrew?
Absolutely, yeah. We're very excited about helping them decarbonize, and they are very keen on cleaning up the steel production. So we're excited to be partnering with them.
And Andrew, can you give this room of lawyers a sense of how big you think your machines are likely to be? Because every different technology has a different size that they're thinking about.
Absolutely. I'll go to the next slide here. I have actually another picture. It may help. Yeah, I won't go through this whole slide, but I think what's really keen is a lot of folks see fusion and immediately start to think about fission, and we're certainly allies with the fission community. I come from a long history of being in the fission industry and very much believe in that technology. But fusion is a very different technology with a far different safety case and hazard profile. And I think one of the keys here when you see a fission power plant up to 36 million square feet of land and the need for water, particularly, and then a fusion power plant in about a 30,000 square foot, standard industrial building that can likely be located, in similarly with many other industrial processes. So I think that's really, really key. This slide hits on a lot of the other things that Jane had already mentioned. But we're very excited at Helion to be moving forward quickly. We're expecting to show net electricity with our concept here in the next year to year and a half, and then very quickly after that move to commercialization. We're working very hard now on our supply chains and understanding our manufacturing and our capability. We actually are just down the street. Some of the buildings you can actually see on that right side in the fusion power plant. That's where our 7th generation device is going to be. And some of the buildings in the background, you may be able to see a plane in the back, are part of the Boeing facility in Everett, Washington. And our goal is to be able to produce one of these devices a day eventually. And we think that could be in the 2030s. So we're very keen on working rapidly to prove our concept and then very quickly move towards mass deployment. And that's one of the keys from a regulatory perspective that we're here to talk about is, there have been important regulatory decisions made in the US and UK, and they're providing really extreme leadership globally in that realm and placing fusion regulation outside of fission and from a material, an industrial type perspective. We do, that is absolutely key to us deploying our first fusion power plants. But we also need to start thinking about mass deployment and what the regulatory structure can look like to support that. And one of the things, looking out how the aviation industry is regulated and how Boeing is able to develop and construct a plane a day and then have that commissioned and flown around the world. So excited about the panel here today, and thank you for the invite, Jane.
Yeah. And so what I want everybody in the room to think about is how the stages that we need to go through, right? So we've got brilliant minds working on constructing and inventing as they go fusion power devices. You can see the innocuity. Look at it. I mean, you could pass that structure and never know it was a fusion power device or a power plant. And the Nuclear Regulatory Commission and the UK have both looked at this. France has looked at it, as is Germany now, and they've seen it comparable to any other industrial facility. So think about all the places it could be located where we couldn't locate other types of dense energy like fission because of the public safety issues. I'm envisioning now, Humphrey's electric railroad with one of these powering the whole of it, or maybe it's several, depending on how that energy is going to be used. But before we get there, we need to build an industry. So fusion science and technology is a piece of it. But how are we going to manufacture that one plant a day for Helion? Maybe there'll be 6 or 7 other companies in the mix building, right? How are we going to build all of that without any rules on what the standards we're building them to? And with health and safety largely taken off the table as a concern, we still have to make these devices capable of delivering what they are designed to do. And that's going to be up to our friend here, Thomas. So this is your turn, Thomas Davis. Explain to them why they can have confidence that there will be a fusion industry building these devices for Helion one a day.
No pressure. So is my stuff pushed? Is that better? Is that working? Put it on. Is it working?
You gotta put,
No? Yeah, no. Yeah. No? Yes. I'll just use it. That one. There you go. Okay. Now I can hear myself. So yeah, thank you, Jane, for the invite, and thank you for hosting and allowing me to speak here. My name's Tom Davis. I will give a very short introduction and then go straight into the sort of detail. My sort of background is I co-founded a company called Oxford Sigma based in the UK, in Oxford. We work on advanced materials for fusion around the world. And my sort of educational background is a PhD in fusion materials, specifically from Oxford University on this topic. I also chair what we call American Society of Mechanical Engineers Boiler and Pressure Vessel Code for fusion. There's a fusion section in it. I'll explain why that's important in a minute. But so my background here is more of how we're going to achieve. I look at the title of the panel, a safe, equitable, and rapid deployment of fusion. I sort of sit in a level of how we actually try to achieve that over the decade to come. And apparently it falls onto me to figure this out. So it's more of a technical perspective, but in terms of how we go approach this, I wrote down a few words by listening to both Andrew and both Jim's online now, and also Humphrey on this. Things what come to my mind is when we say safe and equitable, I also wrote down what's consistent, predictable, quality, and reliable. How do you ensure those things can actually be achieved? And can you convince the countries to host and also the supply chain to deliver, but across borders as well? And how does a regulatory body play a role in that as well? As regulation for fusion is still quite nascent, whereas the UK and US are leading the approach to it. The back end, what comes through is how a supply chain can deliver. It'd be really good to be able to deploy Helion's devices, in numbers around the world. But how do you then maintain that consistency and predictability in a way which is able to help underpin things like the typical things in industries which are outside fusion right now, but things like, how do you underwrite and insure plants in other countries? What sort of mechanisms do you have in place to ensure that the technical delivery does deliver, but consistently delivers for over a period of time that has been promised? How does one even do that? This is all roundabout way of saying the main mechanism that we do it from a technical perspective is through what we call codes and standards. It's a generic term in mechanical engineering and sort of engineering in general. But what it does is it really sets what standards are. A material will be X, Y, Z. You would expect that material to arrive as X, Y, Z, but how do you enforce that? How do you expect the supplier from another country, for example, enforce that? And so that's where I sit. I sit in a position where I am writing said standards in Fusion with a team. It's not just me, I just chair a position. It's more of orchestrating it rather than actually doing some of it. And then a code is more tell you how to implement such a standard. Now, why is that important and why is it even mentioned on the stage? It comes down to safe and equitable and rapid. To me, rapid, the way I interpret rapid fusion deployment is more of if you do it once, that's great. Can you do it 10 times, but can you do it 100 times consistently? To me, rapid is on the hundredth scale perspective. If every device was different in those hundreds, would never be a rapid deployment. We've learned that from history, from other industries, learned that from fission, for example, about changing designs every iteration. That's where standardization comes into play. To the point where standardization in respect of the systems which are most important, there are certain systems in fusion which are important over others. So I set in that position where kind of a hybrid between, countries wanting fusion, about how to sort of enforce, but not from a regulatory standpoint. There could be a regulatory position, but I'm not here obviously to talk on behalf of regulators.
Well, it sounds like you're going to secure, with the codes and standards you're working on, you give finance greater security.
Yes.
That this is moving where it needs to, and you allow diversity within that space. But it seems to me that you're also delivering confidence about the core of most fusion, if not all fusion. And that is, I'm going to call it the boiler, but I know it's not a boiler. He's working on the pressure vessel. Every single fusion entity has a pressure vessel.
Well, yeah, I mean, when you break it down component to component, which I won't go into too depth, but generally things are pressurized because fusion happens in a vacuum. But those components generally don't want to fail because from a operational and/or plant and/or predicting power output, you wouldn't want that to happen. So therefore you have some sort of mechanism in place. Call it quality assurance, essentially what it is, right? But where it becomes important from power stations in general is if the quality assurance is reliant, or the health and safety on the public standpoint is reliant on the quality assurance, it's when regulatory affairs come into play. And that's the bit where we will see infusion over the next 5 years or so come into play and actually understand some of this. And how one enforces it. Is it enforced by the commercial entities, or is it enforced by the national body, or is it a mixture of both? And it's a hybrid generally across all industries, chemical industries, etc.
And what we hope for in fusion is, while every nation is going to have sovereign right over its own regulatory format, we'd love to see a framework of shared understanding develop, so that there is the ability to create the beginning of a diverse supply chain as this technology is emerging from different companies. I see we're joined by Jim McNiel, and he represents TAE, which is actually the oldest of the fusion companies. And Jim, maybe you can introduce TAE to this crowd. TAE also has a special power.
Yes, Jan, can you hear me?
Yes, you need to speak up a little bit.
Okay, is that better?
Better.
Okay. Well, yes, TAE, it was founded in 1998 with the sole purpose of commercializing fusion. Everything that we've done from inception has been informed by that goal. And that's more of an important statement than you might think, because if you're thinking about deploying fusion, we have to check the boxes that you guys have been talking about, which is something that is, number one, buildable, something that is scalable, something that can be located in both densely populated areas as well as remote regions. And for that reason, you have to look at your fuel type, and you have to look at architecture very carefully. And this basic goal has made TAE very unique in both our approach and our design for fusion. We are kind of the black sheep of the family. We're not a company focusing on using deuterium and tritium as our primary fuels. Our focus is to use hydrogen and boron, or what's commonly known as PB11, proton boron 11 fuel. And the reason that is distinctly important is that when you fuse hydrogen and boron, you do not have any primary neutron reactions, meaning you don't produce high energy neutrons, which means you do not have the radiation issues that you have when you're using deuterium and tritium, which means you do not need to breed tritium. You don't need to create a lithium wall or first wall situation. And you do not have the same shielding requirements that you would have if you were burning deuterium and tritium. And so all of these things change not only your reactor design, but they also change, what your ability is in terms of where you locate your systems. So if you look at some of the legislation that's been passed in the United States, which is looking to identify first and foremost the difference between fission and fusion, that's a very important step. You've covered it. Fusion and fission are very different systems. The radiation produced from deuterium and tritium fusion is nascent compared to what you have from a fission reaction, and that's an important distinction. There's another step, which is the difference between deuterium and tritium fusion and boron and hydrogen fusion, which is in the fact we don't produce any radioactive waste or any primary neutrons. And so that changes the entire profile of the system. So while we really encourage, the regulatory issues from a manufacturing standpoint that we're talking about, our system requirements are quite different than the majority of the field. For instance, we do not need to use high temperature superconducting magnets for our current systems, and we don't need to have, thick walls of reinforced concrete with steel, or a big dome such as ITER. So those are very, very different aspects of what we do. Currently, we're operating our 5th generation reactor, which is called Norman. Norman was set out to achieve 35 million degrees in a confinement time of 10 milliseconds. We have pushed that engineering design to over 80 million degrees C plasma, and really an indefinite confinement of plasma, which means we've got to about 40 milliseconds based on the power we have to throw at it. Our next machine is designed to increase that substantially. This machine is called Copernicus. It's being built in Irvine, California. And Copernicus will achieve that first level of fusion, which is 100 million degrees. The reason that's an important level is for the deuterium and tritium community. It's the temperature at which you can get those two isotopes to fuse. And so at that point, we will demonstrate net energy out, which is the holy grail or I should say the Kitty Hawk moment of fusion, which is to prove that we can produce more energy from a fusion reaction than it required to power it. And then after that machine has achieved that fusion demonstration of net energy out, we will take the lessons we've learned from this very, capable high range demonstration device, and we will build our 7th generation machine, which is called Da Vinci, which is slated to be done at the end of this decade, and that will push electrons to the grid. So the thing that is important is that any fusion solution that is successful at getting to a Q of greater than 1 or net energy out is something that we all need and we all support. And we're just taking a very different approach because we feel that boron is super abundant. It's on the Earth's crust. We mine it by the metric ton. It costs about, you take about 400 pounds of boron to power a 500 megawatt plant for a year. You could deliver your fuel in a pickup truck. You don't need rails. You don't need pipelines. You don't need to breed, tritium or any other, rare elements. And every country could have enough access to boron to power, every building, every light, every industry that they could ever hope for. So that's what makes TAE different.
Right. And I think I can say that all of the different fusion devices differ in uses of the activating materials, but TAE stands alone in its use of boron. And then Andrew, Helion is called Helion because why don't you take that?
Yeah, so we actually use a little bit different than the deuterium tritium reaction as well. We use deuterium helium-3, neither of which are radioactive, and also our main reaction of deuterium helium-3 doesn't produce any neutrons as well, or radioactive material products, but we do have some side reactions of deuterium in our concept, which do produce some tritium, which is actually a benefit for us as tritium then decays back into helium-3 with a half-life of 12.5 years. So our fuel cycle will actually be closed once we have enough devices up and running, so that we're actually producing tritium, holding it for a period of time, and then reusing it as helium-3 fuel. So it's actually a very, very novel concept.
So you've heard from two of the companies. Commonwealth Fusion System was the third that was going to join us, and they are approaching fusion from the best known and the oldest approach to fusion that's been known, which is a tokamak. And that's what most people who are familiar at all with fusion know of. I'm not going to speak for them. You'll hear from them in lots of different ways if you start to look at fusion. But now you're seeing sort of the range, but throughout the range, fusion is going to be available for use. Now you've heard a commitment of 2028 for its first power delivery from Helion, and we've just heard that Jim McNiel said that they intend to deliver electricity in this decade. That's very different from a lot of the other discussions, and that means everybody in this room knows something that most people who think they know fusion don't know. And that's why we need your help thinking about, okay, well, we're going to need to establish enough comfort with the health and safety codes, look to Thomas, and to the regulatory forums that are underway now. But more important, and I can say this having spent 30 years in renewables, will be the incentives, the regulatory and legal and policy work that this room could produce and other rooms can produce to drive this faster. Because as we all know, until we start really challenging fossil fuels, that is our future. And that will shorten the human race's future on this planet. And if you look to Humphrey, I mean, Humphrey's got plans. I think he'd probably give you some dimensions, guys, on the size of the power devices he'd like to see starting in Tanzania. There are markets waiting for fusion. And so we need to prepare not just the law and not just the codes and standards, but we also have to prepare the workforce. We have to create the understanding and the talent pool. Some of you may be part of that, because as we know, there isn't a company out there that doesn't need legal teams advising them. And all of this is going to take money. And I'm glad you raised your hand, because I was just going to ask if there are questions in the audience, because I'd much rather allow our professionals here to answer your questions than talk. So please, is there a microphone? Is there a?
Missing in most conversations about technology development, the part of societal readiness.
Hang on one second. Guys, can you hear this? Andrew and Jim?
No, you have to repeat the question when he's done, Jane.
I'm sorry.
Yes.
Thank you very much for the very interesting presentation. And one of the things that I've been missing in most of technology development discussions is the part of societal readiness. So this has shown to be a showstopper, and I think there's enough evidence for that. So I think a very interesting question is, what is the status quo of societal readiness, and how are we constructing such societal readiness, especially trust? Because I mean, this is not an easy one, and we need to engage with society, with communities in co-creating trust. So this is I don't remember the right phrasing, but a credible, fast, and
Equitable, fast.
equitable, fast, the fast tracking energy transition. So I will be really interested in having such a discussion. Thank you.
And I've been warned that we are now on a tight time frame, so I want to hear from everybody. I want the questions, and if questions don't get asked now, please send them. I will leave my email, and I'll make sure if I can't answer them, someone else will. So is there another question in the room? Yes, right here in the front.
What is your name? Where are you from, and who are you associated with?
My name is Yasmin. I'm actually a year 3 law student here at Middlesex University, a more mature student. I used to be a banker and decided that that wasn't really my purpose, and decided to do something that I felt served humanity, which I think law does in the right channels. I'm a complete layman to everything that you've spoken about today, and I really want to educate myself. So there's a couple of questions that I have of the things that you mentioned. So we talk about the positives of these things, but when you're dealing with a new demographic who doesn't have any education on these types of innovations, we have to learn how to crawl before we can walk. So some of the things that you mentioned sound very attractive, but what are the negatives? What are the pitfalls that you're dealing with regard to fusion? That's one of the questions that I had. And then the second question that I had was, I think it was Mr. McNiel who had mentioned the plethora of availability of, is it boron or boron?
Boron.
Yes, and that obviously I guess that implies that it's more cost effective and resource light rather than resource heavy. And if that's such an implied reality, why is it taking so long for these things to get implemented? Obviously, there's governmental challenges and the powers that be. I mentioned the elephant in the room. Yes. What's happening with that? Give us a layman explanation to some of these things so that we can walk away and kind of support your cause with confidence.
And I know we're tight on time, so I just want to thank you for your question, and you hit so many areas. I'm not sure we're going to have the time to cover them all, but I can say and ask my team here to jump in at any moment. We know the elephant in the room. Fusion has been worked on, as you know now from Jim, since '98. It is hard to do. it is tough physics, it's tough engineering, and the difference has come in breakthroughs in materials. Superconducting magnetic tape is used by a lot of the different technology companies. Supercomputing has allowed a lot of the physics and the other science to be challenged, and also different forms of machining, and whether it be 3D printing or other new forms of welding techniques. These are all some of the things that have changed over time. Since, for instance, the
Add
law
machine learning,
between-
Jane, certainly. Add
sorry,
machine
what?
learning as well. Machine learning and artificial intelligence has made a big difference in plasma stability.
Right. So I can't tell you how we're going to challenge the big elephants, but I would say there are already nibbles around. And I would say to everybody in the room, because most of you are younger, we are offering you your future. So I think I would challenge you back and say, this is yours. Push the companies hard, push the supply chain hard, and insist on fusion in your mix as soon as fusion is ready. And before then, what we can do is really expand where the resources are there, the renewables we know about today. But we don't have to cite a whole host of fossil plants to support those renewables, because fusion will balance them.
Hey, Jane, may I
it-
comment on this as
Yes,
well?
please do.
Yeah, I think that the petroleum industry, which is obviously the elephant in the room, is really not the enemy here. What they are is one of the most talented workforces that we could ever hope for. You know, we're talking about daily production of about 6,800 gigawatts of power, 40% of which is fossil fuel. We need to be able to replace that fossil fuel energy with clean energy. So, and we know that our demand is doubling between now and 2050, and some predict it's going to treble. If you deliver power at current prices that the fusion industry can achieve in a competitive way, you're talking about a $40 trillion industry that's going to need the largest workforce you could ever imagine. So the people that know how to build sophisticated refineries and distribution systems are going to be a really critical part of this workforce. We're going to need to be able to build fusion plants in a central location, pack them on a ship them around the world, stand them up, train a workforce to commission them and operate them. So, and we need all of the people in each of the countries to deal with the regulatory issues. And most importantly, to the earlier part of the question, the societal, challenge, here in the United States, 80% of the people do not know what fusion is. They don't know the difference between fission and fusion. And the word nuclear scares everybody. So the first thing we have to do is we have to educate the entire world, the general population, that fusion is what happens in the sun. Everything we know on this planet exists because of that star, that nearby star that's heated up all of the plants and animals that are now being extracted from the ground and burned as hydrocarbons. We have the opportunity to replicate that power on Earth, and we're going to need the largest mobilization of talent that this planet's ever seen. And we're going to need to, do it on a scale of, like, say, the Apollo project, which would be $250 billion in today's standards. So if we really wanted to have a bold decadal move to make fusion happen, what about $25 billion a year for 10 years? Because the thing that's preventing us from getting to fusion faster is not the science, it's not the engineering, it's the capital. So we're basically, we have operated for 25 years on $1.2 billion. We're in the process of closing another round so we can go to the next step. The stranglehold here is just access to capital and the amount of time our management team has to take to secure that funds instead of, pencil and paper working on fusion.
So just to put that in context of what we've been discussing here, anyone in this room that is interested in fusion and adds that to their studies can pretty much guarantee that there'll be work. There'll be too much work. There is a lot to be done, and all of you will have a role because it's, whether it be advising, whether it be advising perhaps a company, perhaps a finance. I see somebody who's already come from banking. Perfect choice. Or it's advising the supply chain or the manufacturing, right? But you can see how these things link up, or it's working in specific countries to help them build their infrastructure because they know that it'll be powered by fusion. And to Jim's point, we formed Energy for the Common Good because in the experience of energy, the biggest unknown factor, the thing that can slow down new technologies faster and longer than anything, are people. Because people who don't understand something, who've never heard of it, have heard of it perhaps delivered with suspicion or whatever, which, by the way, when fusion starts moving, I know there'll be a lot of that because fusion is going to challenge that elephant in the room. Fusion is challenging fission. That's not because they're companies that are competing directly. It's because the idea of what fusion can produce changes other markets. So while Jim is being a wonderfully nice person by saying, look at that workforce, we can just pull them in. And yes, that'll happen. Just as many of the folks who are working on fusion came from fission. But it's also a workforce we haven't even begun to develop yet. And that's why Humphrey and the youth, the under 30 potential is so important to fusion's future. So thank you.